For 24 years, Judge Eleanor Lancaster held dominion over her courtroom like a queen presiding over a kingdom carved from fear, silence, and absolute control. Her reputation was as infamous as it was untouchable, an iron-willed enforcer of justice in name only, manipulating trials, dismissing evidence, and crushing dissent beneath her cold, calculated rule. Within her grand courtroom, adorned with polished wood, towering oak-paneled walls, and an ancient chandelier that cast a heavy, golden glow across the space, justice had long ceased to be a pursuit of truth. Instead, it had been weaponized and distorted to serve one woman's power-hungry agenda. Everyone who entered that space, attorneys, defendants, jurors, understood the rules: speak carefully, act cautiously, and never challenge Lancaster. The silence in her court wasn't accidental. It was inherited, conditioned, a rehearsed fear that kept everyone in line. Her piercing blue eyes and unforgiving mouth communicated far more than her voice ever needed to. She didn't shout, she didn't have to. Her authority was so complete, her reputation so fearsome, that the mere rustle of her robes could silence a room. Dressed in her judge's robe like it was royal garb, she would adjust her glasses with an air of boredom, as if each case was just another performance in a script she had already written. Today, she thought, would be no different, but standing across the room at the defense table was someone who had come to shatter that illusion. His name was Malcolm Carter, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for taking the cases no one else dared to touch. Battle-worn but unbroken, Carter wasn't just there to defend his client, Jerome Willis. He was there to take a stand. Carter had spent his career challenging a system designed to crush men like Jerome, especially black men, accused with flimsy evidence, tried without fairness, and judged before they even spoke. Today, he was going up against the one judge many believed was untouchable. But Malcolm Carter didn't believe in waiting for justice, he believed in demanding it. As he stood, tall and calm, next to his client, there was a quiet storm in his eyes, focused, deliberate, and utterly fearless. He knew exactly who Eleanor Lancaster was and what she was capable of. But he didn't flinch. Jerome, on the other hand, sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his shoulders weighed down by years of hopeless encounters with a system that had always seen him as guilty by default. A black man accused of armed robbery, what more did Lancaster need to convict? To her, that was the story, that was enough. But Malcolm leaned in, voice steady and low, telling Jerome with quiet intensity, "We're not losing today." Jerome didn't nod, he barely moved. Hope wasn't something he allowed himself to feel anymore. Hope had failed him too many times. This trial, for Malcolm, was about more than one man's freedom. It was about confronting a system that had enabled Lancaster to manipulate justice unchecked for over 2 decades. It was about holding her accountable for the lives she had ruined, for the biases she had normalized, for the rules she had bent beyond recognition. As the room waited in tense silence, the court clerk finally rose and announced the case, the state of Alabama versus Jerome Willis. The words echoed with chilling detachment, as if they didn't carry the weight of a man's life. Jerome tensed. He had heard this story before. He had lived it. A name, a charge, a courtroom that didn't care whether the evidence held up, as long as the defendant looked like him. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, Daniel Calloway, stood with the smug confidence of someone who believed he was on the winning side of power. Young, ambitious, and eager to impress, Calloway began his case with polished charm, telling the jury that the evidence would show Jerome had entered a liquor store with a firearm. He promised surveillance footage, eyewitnesses, and more. Malcolm immediately stood to object, pointing out that the footage was too blurry to definitively identify his client. But Lancaster barely acknowledged him. "Overruled," she said with a dismissive flick of her hand. Her voice like ice, she warned Malcolm not to waste the court's time with theatrics. A veiled threat reminding him who controlled the narrative. Calloway smirked and continued, while Lancaster allowed every word to pass unchecked. Malcolm objected again and again, pointing out procedural violations, misleading statements, But each time, Lancaster shut him down. It was a courtroom drama where the ending had already been written. The jury shifted uneasily. A few members, especially a middle-aged woman and an elderly man, exchanged quiet glances. They sensed something was wrong, something unjust, but they didn't know how to act on it. That was Lancaster's power. She didn't need to silence people with threats. She silenced them with precedent, with years of intimidation and carefully orchestrated outcomes. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm Carter felt the full weight of that reality. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a stage for execution masquerading as a courtroom. And yet, he didn't back down. Not today, not this time, because behind every cold ruling, every silenced objection, and every unjust conviction Lancaster had ever made, there was a pattern Malcolm Carter had come to expose. The courtroom fell into a tense, heavy silence as the trial commenced. The moment the case was announced, the state of Alabama versus Jerome Willis, it was as if an invisible weight dropped over the room. Everyone knew what this trial meant, especially in Judge Eleanor Lancaster's courtroom. It was a stage where the verdict had already been rehearsed, and guilt was often assigned before evidence was even heard. Jerome Willis, a black man accused of armed robbery, sat motionless beside his lawyer, Malcolm Carter, knowing exactly what lay ahead. He had lived through this script before. The accusations may change, the faces may differ, but the system remained the same, cold, blind, and inherently biased. Across the room, Prosecutor Daniel Calloway stood with the cocky assurance of a man who believed the system was built for people like him. Young, sharp, ambitious, Calloway was eager to make an impression, and today that meant winning favor with the judge. As he smoothed out his tie and addressed the jury with polished ease, his voice oozed confidence. "This is a simple case," he declared. "The evidence will show that the defendant entered Carter's liquor store with a firearm. Witnesses will testify to his presence. Surveillance footage places him at the scene." It all sounded clean, crisp, too neat. Malcolm Carter, standing tall and unmoved, interrupted with calm authority. "Objection. Misrepresentation of evidence. There is no clear footage identifying my client, only a blurred figure that could be anyone." The moment hung in the air. Judge Lancaster didn't even glance up. "Overruled," she said curtly, waving her hand in irritation. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you choose your objections wisely. I will not allow theatrics in my courtroom." Her words, cold and clipped, were a warning dressed as formality. Malcolm knew it for what it was, a command to sit down and shut up. But he didn't. He stood tall, his jaw clenched, his gaze steady. He had expected resistance, just not so blatantly early in the trial. Calloway resumed, spinning a story of crime and danger, of a man caught in the act. It was a story the courtroom had heard before, countless times, painted with stereotypes and shaped by assumptions. The prosecution didn't need to say outright that Jerome was dangerous. His skin color had already done that work for them. Meanwhile, Judge Lancaster let it all unfold without a flicker of concern. Every time Malcolm objected, whether to leading questions, exaggerated claims, or outright violations of court procedure, she shut him down. Sustained. "Move on, Mr. Carter." Her words sliced through the room like blades. Not seeking fairness but enforcing control. One by one, Malcolm watched the rules being twisted, bent, and then discarded entirely. The law was no longer the foundation of the trial. It was a tool Lancaster wielded to maintain her dominance. In the jury box, some members began to squirm. Not all of them were oblivious. A middle-aged woman in the front row, a retired man in the back, they exchanged glances. Their expressions uncertain, disturbed. They saw it, the imbalance, the favoritism, the courtroom that felt less like a hall of justice and more like a stage play with a fixed ending. But even seeing wasn't the same as speaking. Not in this courtroom, not under Lancaster's watch. For the first time in a long while, Malcolm Carter felt the suffocating pressure of being silenced by power. He had walked into this trial prepared for a fight, but what he encountered was no fight at all. It was an execution under the guise of legal process. The verdict had already been decided. The rest was just performance. Still, Malcolm didn't allow the despair to crush him. He had been here before, seen this game played out more times than he cared to count. But today was different. Today he wasn't just fighting for Jerome's freedom. He was fighting to dismantle the system that allowed judges like Lancaster to reign unchecked. And yet, Lancaster wasn't just any judge. She had decades of silence in her corner. She had a courtroom that feared her. She had power that had never been questioned, until now. The courtroom was charged with tension as Malcolm rose again, refusing to surrender. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate. He knew the odds, but he also knew the truth had a way of breaking through when you least expected it. His voice cut through the stillness as he reached for a stack of documents, evidence not just of Jerome's innocence, but of Lancaster's long-standing pattern of judicial misconduct. The room shifted. Even Calloway's smirk faded slightly. Lancaster's eyes, cold and sharp, finally lifted from her bench to meet his. She sensed it too, the shift in momentum, the tremor in the ground she had once ruled so firmly. But she wasn't ready to fall. Not yet. Her response was swift and brutal. She dismissed Malcolm's claims as irrelevant, refused to acknowledge the documents, and barked orders to stay on track. But Malcolm didn't back down. He wasn't here to play by her rules. He was here to rewrite them. And the more she pushed, the more obvious it became to everyone watching. This wasn't about a single case anymore. This was about power, about truth, about whether justice still had a place in a courtroom that had forgotten how to deliver it. Jerome sat quietly throughout it all, a man who had been forced to accept the silence for far too long. But now, for the first time, he felt something shift, not just around him, but within him. Malcolm was speaking not just for him, but for every man who had ever been crushed under Lancaster's gavel. And as the trial pushed forward, with each objection denied and every truth ignored, one thing became clear: this trial was reaching a breaking point. A storm was coming, and at its center stood a man who had spent his life preparing for this very moment. Malcolm Carter wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A thick, oppressive silence settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud moments from breaking. Judge Eleanor Lancaster sat high above them all, cloaked in her black robe, fingers tapping idly against the wooden bench, her face an unreadable mask carved from cold marble. Though the prosecution had presented its so-called evidence, flimsy and circumstantial at best, she showed no interest in the weight of its truth. Only in the performance that was meant to follow, a conviction already written in her mind. Jerome Willis, the accused, sat halfway to being condemned, not by the facts, but by the system that had marked him as guilty the moment he entered the room. But Malcolm Carter was not done, not by a long shot. Rising slowly, with a calm that defied the electric tension swirling around him, he reached into his briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of documents. His voice, smooth and sharp, sliced through the heavy silence. "Your Honor," he said, his tone steady but edged with quiet thunder. "Before we proceed, I would like to submit into evidence a report, one that sheds light on a pattern of judicial misconduct spanning over 2 decades. His words struck the room like a bolt of lightning. A hush fell instantly. Across the aisle, Daniel Calloway's trademark smirk faltered. And for the first time in this trial, Judge Lancaster lifted her full gaze from her bench. Her blue eyes narrowed, her posture stiffened, and a flicker of unease danced in the air. Malcolm continued without missing a beat, holding up the documents like a sword drawn for battle. "This," he said, "is a list of past cases tried in this very courtroom. Cases where defendants, primarily black men, were systematically denied fair trials under Judge Lancaster's rulings. Cases where objections were dismissed without cause, where evidence was ignored, where every single one, by sheer coincidence, ended in conviction." He paused deliberately, letting the gravity of his accusation fill the room. "Convictions," he repeated, with the full weight of history behind the word. The tension became unbearable. Lancaster's gavel slammed down like thunder. "Enough," she barked, her voice cracking through the courtroom like a whip. "Mr. Carter, this is irrelevant to the case at hand. I will not allow baseless accusations to derail my courtroom." But Malcolm did not blink. He stood rooted like a mountain unmoved by storm. "Baseless?" he repeated, his voice now coolly defiant. "These are public records, Your Honor, court transcripts. Every single one of these cases can be verified. Are you saying transcripts from your own court are irrelevant?" Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the bench, the jury shifting in their seats, suddenly alert. They weren't sure what they were witnessing, but they knew it was something monumental. Interest flickered in their eyes. Uncertainty replaced by curiosity. Lancaster exhaled sharply, her jaw clenched. "I will not entertain conspiracy theories," she hissed, "unless you have direct, relevant evidence pertaining to this case. I suggest you move on." But Malcolm wasn't finished. He turned toward the back of the courtroom, where the heavy double doors loomed shut. Then, as if on cue, they creaked open. A collective breath caught in the gallery. Heads turned. Whispers surged like a rising tide. A woman entered, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Posture stiff, face pale but resolved, she moved with determination, as if each step carried the weight of memory and courage. To some, she was familiar. To others, she was a ghost. But to Judge Eleanor Lancaster, she was the last person she ever wanted to see. Her expression didn't crack, but her eyes betrayed her. The woman approached the witness stand, placed a trembling hand on the rail, then turned to face the courtroom. Malcolm met her gaze and gave a small, steadying nod. "State your name for the court," he said. Her voice, though unsteady, rang clear. "Sophie Bennett." The name hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasping echoed from the gallery. Whispers spread like fire, because Sophie Bennett wasn't just anyone, she was Lancaster's former court clerk. And she had vanished 3 years ago. Lancaster snapped, her voice sharp and panicked. "This is highly irregular. This witness is not on the list. She has no standing in this case." Malcolm countered instantly. "Actually, Your Honor, Miss Bennett has direct and critical evidence that pertains not only to this case, but to the integrity of every trial that has passed through this courtroom under your ruling." Then, with trembling fingers, Sophie lifted a small black USB drive and held it up for all to see. The room fell still, frozen by the enormity of the moment. Even before the contents were revealed, everyone could feel it. This was it. The moment everything would change. For the first time in 24 years, Eleanor Lancaster was not in control. She sensed the shift, the power slipping, the attention shifting, the room turning. She adjusted her robe as if to reassert dominance, then glared down at Malcolm. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cold but no longer unshakable, "I have had enough of your antics." Her words were venomous, but lacked the strength they once carried. "Your Honor, if I may," Malcolm began, but was cut off by a sudden crack of the gavel. "You may not," she snapped. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court offices by the door. "Arrest Mr. Carter for obstruction of justice." Gasps surged like a tidal wave. Even Calloway stared, stunned. The officers hesitated, uncertain, caught in disbelief. Then they moved. Boots echoed against the marble as 2 officers approached Malcolm, handcuffs ready. But he didn't move, didn't panic, didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that unsettled everyone watching. "I think you should be very careful, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. Lancaster froze. "Excuse me?" she hissed. Malcolm calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a second USB drive. This one small and silver. He held it up between his fingers, letting it glint in the courtroom light. "This trial was never just about Jerome Willis," he said. "This trial is about something much bigger." Lancaster's face tightened, color draining. "What is that?" she demanded. But now her voice held something new. Fear. Malcolm rotated the USB between his fingers, like a magician about to unveil his final trick. "Just a little something I think the jury, no, the entire world, will find very interesting." The tension became suffocating. All eyes were on him. he continued, a voice from the past. Someone who used to work for you. Someone who saw everything. Lancaster's eyes darted to Sophie Bennett. Her expression, for the first time, betrayed panic. She was losing control, and Malcolm Carter, standing firm, knew exactly what came next. The courtroom held its collective breath as the silver USB glinted under the light. Suspended between Malcolm Carter's fingers like a key to an unknown vault. Every eye locked on him. Every heartbeat paused, waiting to hear what would come next. Judge Eleanor Lancaster sat frozen behind her bench. Her face still composed, but her fingers trembled slightly, knuckles white as they clutched the gavel, a weapon she had always wielded with unchallenged authority. Now little more than a symbol of power slipping through her grasp. The jury, once passive observers, now leaned in, curiosity ignited, doubt beginning to blossom in the cracks of what they thought was a straightforward trial. Malcolm, unwavering, took a breath, then stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but unyielding, "since you dismissed every objection I've made, perhaps you'd allow me just one final submission." The words weren't just formal, they were loaded, heavy with meaning, and everyone in the room could feel it. Lancaster's eyes narrowed, fury flickering behind them, but she knew she was trapped. If she blocked him again, the jury would see it as a cover-up. With clenched teeth, she forced out the word, "Fine." Malcolm moved with measured precision, inserting the USB into the court's audio system. A beat of static, and then the room was hit with a voice, clear, cold, undeniable. "I don't care if they're guilty or not. As long as I get paid. I decide their fate." The words rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. One juror visibly recoiled, eyes wide with shock. Even Daniel Calloway, the once confident prosecutor, sat stunned, pen slipping from his fingers as he realized what they had just heard. But the voice continued, her voice. "You think these idiots will ever figure it out? The jury listens to me. The defense, irrelevant. I control this courtroom, and as long as I do, no one, not the law, not the press, not some desperate lawyer, can touch me." Silence followed, not the calm kind, but the kind that suffocates, thick and overwhelming. And then, softly, from the defense table, came a voice, "Jerome Willis." And there it is. He didn't sound angry, just tired. His voice carried the weight of someone who had always known the system was rigged, but had never expected to hear the rules spoken aloud. Lancaster shot up from her chair, face drained of color, voice shrill. "This is outrageous." But her outrage was hollow. Malcolm met her outburst with ice-cold steadiness. "Outrageous?" he echoed. "That's an interesting choice of words, Your Honor, because to me," he turned toward the jury, then the press now scribbling feverishly in their notepads, "this sounds more like justice." Lancaster's hands shook, her mask of composure had cracked, and behind it was something raw, fear, desperation, the realization that her kingdom was crumbling around her. But the fall wasn't over yet. The trial was no longer about Jerome Willis, and everyone knew it. The courtroom was no longer Lancaster's to control. The power had shifted. The people watching from the gallery weren't just spectators anymore, they were witnesses to history. Lancaster tried to steady herself, but her breathing was shallow. The walls that had once echoed her authority now pressed in, closing around her. She looked to Calloway, to the court officers, to anyone who might still stand with her. But no one moved, not even the officers. They had all heard the recording. They had seen the truth laid bare. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but no one would ever know. Because in that moment, the doors to the courtroom swung open again. Two men in dark suits entered, badges gleaming, steps firm and deliberate. The lead agent raised a piece of paper. His voice was calm, official, final. "Judge Eleanor Lancaster," he said, "we have a warrant for your arrest." A stunned silence fell. The jury sat frozen. Calloway stared blankly, and Lancaster, once the embodiment of control, now looked small. Her towering presence deflated in an instant. "No!" she cried, rising suddenly, her voice cracked with disbelief. I am a sitting judge. You can't do this. She spun, eyes darting to each familiar face, searching for support, but support never came. The very courtroom that once obeyed her now watched in silence. The agents stepped forward. You have the right to remain silent, one of them said, and as he reached for her wrists, the metallic clink of the handcuffs echoed like a gavel striking the end of her reign. Lancaster didn't struggle, but her body stiffened, resisting the truth even as it enclosed around her. As they led her down the steps, she turned one last time toward Malcolm Carter. Their eyes met, hers, filled with fury, disbelief, and something else she had never shown before: defeat. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, voice low, unwavering. Looks like justice finally caught up with you. The doors slammed shut behind her with a sound that marked the end, not just of her trial, but of her power, and for the first time in decades, that courtroom no longer belonged to Eleanor Lancaster. It belonged to the people. The moment Judge Eleanor Lancaster was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the entire space seemed to freeze in time. The once dominant figure who had commanded this room with a mere glance was now reduced to a shadow of her former authority. And the heavy wooden doors closing behind her echoed like a final judgment. Yet even in her absence, the weight of her influence still lingered like smoke after a fire, haunting, bitter, and unmistakable. Everyone sat stunned, the gallery, the jury, even the bailiffs. Silence hung heavy, not from reverence, but from shock. Then, as if emerging from the fog of disbelief, a voice rose from the jury box. The jury has reached a verdict, the foreman announced. All eyes snapped toward the panel. The room, though physically unchanged, now held a completely different energy, one of reckoning. The foreman stood slowly, hands clutching the edge of the rail, knuckles white as he cleared his throat. In the case of the state of Alabama versus Jerome Willis, he began. And in that moment, the air turned so dense it seemed impossible to breathe. Every word felt suspended, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Jerome sat unmoving, his hands gripping the table, not in anticipation but in disbelief. He had learned not to expect justice, not to believe in it, because justice had never been on his side. Beside him, Malcolm Carter stood motionless as well, not from doubt, but from focus. His heart pounded, not for himself, but for the man beside him, the man who had been condemned before his name was even announced in court. The foreman continued, "We find the defendant not guilty." The words hit like a thunderclap. A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Someone clapped a hand over their mouth, and a brief, stunned silence followed before the realization truly set in. Jerome remained frozen for a heartbeat longer, then blinked. It was real. It had actually happened. He was free. "Mr. Willis," the interim judge called from the bench, breaking the spell. "You are free to go." The shackles around Jerome's wrists were unfastened with a soft metallic click that felt louder than the gavel had ever been. He stared at his hands, now unbound, as if he didn't quite recognize them. No chains, no cuffs, just skin, breath, and the fragile reality of freedom. "You really did it," he whispered, turning to Malcolm, voice cracked with emotion. Malcolm placed a steady hand on his shoulder and replied, "No, Jerome, we did it." The courtroom slowly began to stir again, but now with a completely different energy. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, pens scribbling furiously, cameras snapping, the entire room shifting into a kind of historic urgency. This wasn't just a verdict, it was a statement, a reckoning. Malcolm took a step forward, eyes sweeping over the room, taking in the stunned jurors, the rigid posture of the prosecutors, the spectators whose faces reflected everything from relief to disbelief. Then his eyes landed on Daniel Calloway, the young prosecutor, once brimming with confidence and assured in his alliance with Lancaster, now sat in stunned silence. The notes he had taken during trial now lay scattered and meaningless in front of him. His pen rested on the table, unmoving, and his face, once sure, now pale, betrayed the internal reckoning taking place. He had believed himself to be part of the justice system. He had believed he was one of the good guys. But now, Confronted with the truth, he saw what he had really been, a pawn, a participant in a rigged game. How many others, he wondered silently, had been led to prison by his blind trust in a judge he never questioned? Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "Today," he said firmly, voice echoing through the courtroom, "we corrected a mistake." He let the words hang for a moment, then continued, "But let's not pretend this is the first time something like this has happened. And let's not pretend it'll be the last." Murmurs began to rise in the gallery, not in protest, but in agreement. Malcolm looked across the room, his voice unwavering. "There are more Lancasters out there, more courtrooms like this one. And if we don't fight back, if we don't hold people accountable, it will happen again. It always does." The room fell into a deep, contemplative silence. Everyone present knew he was right. The trial had exposed more than a corrupt judge. It had exposed a system that had grown too comfortable in its own power, too indifferent to the lives it was supposed to protect. Then Malcolm turned back to Jerome and gave a small nod toward the exit. "Come on," he said gently, "let's get you out of here." Together, they walked toward the courtroom doors, not just stepping away from a trial, but from years of injustice. And just before Malcolm passed through, he turned once more to face the room. His voice, this time softer, carried the weight of a final truth. "Justice doesn't just happen," he said. "It takes people like you, like me, fighting for it. Every single day." He paused, allowing the room to absorb the meaning. Then a small, knowing smile crossed his face. "And this fight, it's only just beginning, because justice is never given. It's taken back." With those final words, he turned and stepped through the doors into the light beyond, leaving behind not just a courtroom, but a legacy of resistance that would echo far beyond its walls. The courtroom that had once been a fortress of fear and silence now buzzed with the electricity of change. Just minutes ago, it belonged to Judge Eleanor Lancaster. She had ruled every corner, dictated every outcome, and silenced every dissenting voice with a flick of her gavel. But now, she was gone, and in her place lingered only the stunned air of transformation. The jurors, once bound by the rigidity of courtroom routine, now sat frozen, not from order, but from disbelief. Some gripped the arms of their chairs tightly, their knuckles pale, while others exchanged glances filled with uncertainty. A woman who had spent the entire trial scribbling meticulous notes had stopped writing altogether. A man near the front row, his bearing that of a retired teacher, slowly shook his head in quiet astonishment. His hands were clasped in front of him, clenched so tight the veins in his arms stood out. They had entered this courtroom expecting to judge Jerome Willis, a man they were told had committed a crime. But what they had witnessed was something far greater, the unraveling of a lie so deep it had poisoned the very foundations of the court. Across the room, Prosecutor Daniel Calloway sat in a silence heavier than any argument. At the trial's beginning, he had carried himself like a rising star, composed, confident, even smug. He had believed in the process. He had believed in Judge Lancaster. He had believed that justice was a path paved by following the rules as they were handed down to him. But now those beliefs lay in tatters on the floor before him. His notes, once carefully written and full of strategy, looked meaningless now. His pen rested beside them, still, and on his face was the unmistakable look of a man who had just realized he was not the hero in the story, he was a tool. A pawn, a servant of a system that had asked for his loyalty but never his questions. As his breath came shallow and slow, a question began to echo inside him. How many innocent men had he helped convict under Lancaster's rulings? How many lives had been ruined by his trust in a woman who saw justice as a performance and power as her right? He lifted his eyes, and for the first time, he saw Lancaster for what she truly was, not a symbol of law, not a protector of truth, but a fraud cloaked in legal robes. Judge Lancaster, who had once held her courtroom in an unshakable grip, was now a name soaked in betrayal. And worse, she had taken others down with her. Her corruption wasn't just her own, it had rippled through the lives of every person who sat in her courtroom. Her hands had shaped not verdicts, but futures. Futures broken by bias. Futures shattered by pride. And now that truth stood naked before them all. Her breathing, so steady and authoritative throughout the trial, had grown shallow by the end. Her hands, once symbols of command, had trembled on the bench before the handcuffs took hold. The eyes that once made lawyers wilt under their stare now darted helplessly, searching for support where none remained. She had demanded respect for 24 years. But what she saw now in the eyes of the people was not reverence, it was disgust. It was betrayal, and perhaps most painful of all, it was recognition. They finally saw her. The room, though the same four walls, was transformed. Its energy had shifted. The weight that had once suppressed truth was now lifting. And in its place was something rare: justice. No longer just a word but a presence. Fragile but awakening. Everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't about Jerome Willis anymore. It wasn't even about Lancaster alone. It was about every time the scales of justice had been tilted and no one had spoken. It was about every lawyer too afraid to push back. Every juror too uncertain to ask the hard questions. Every official too complicit to care. Now, for the first time, the room knew what justice sounded like. It wasn't the crack of a gavel or the monotone reading of verdicts. It was truth, raw and undeniable, echoing from a hidden voice recorder, standing tall in Malcolm Carter's defiance, and shining through the eyes of a man who had finally been set free. Jerome Willis sat quietly, absorbing the impossible reality that he was no longer a prisoner, not of the law, and not of the past. And though his freedom had been announced minutes ago, its weight was only just settling into his bones. He was a man who had lived under the expectation of guilt for so long that innocence felt surreal. But beside him stood someone who had never wavered. Malcolm Carter, the lawyer who had walked into the lion's den with nothing but truth in his hands and determination in his eyes. He hadn't just fought for one man, he had challenged an empire. And he had won. The courtroom, once Lancaster's domain, was no longer hers to command. The story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the people now. And in that moment of collective awakening, one truth was seared into every heart present. Justice had finally come, not by chance, not by favor, but because someone had refused to stop fighting. The courtroom stood on the edge of transformation, not just as a room where a trial had ended, but as a symbol of something greater, an institution cracked open. Its truth finally exposed to light. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was not empty, it was charged. Breathless, dense with everything that had just happened. Judge Eleanor Lancaster had been removed from the bench. Not in retirement or resignation, but in handcuffs, led through the very doors she once ruled behind. That alone had shifted the air. But the aftermath, the realization that justice had prevailed over unchecked power, was still sinking into every wall, every eye, every breath within that space. Then, with a steadying voice, the jury foreman stood and addressed the court. "We find the defendant not guilty," he said, and those 5 words echoed louder than any gavel ever had. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Restrained but visceral, someone gasped. Another wiped away a tear. Jerome Willis, the man who had entered this courtroom accused, judged, and nearly condemned without fair hearing, sat motionless for a second longer, as if his body refused to believe it was safe to feel anything. Then the voice of the judge confirmed it: he was free. The shackles, which had for years become a metaphor for his life, were unclasped with a soft click. And in that sound was the collapse of every false narrative that had been built against him. He stared at his wrists in stunned silence. The absence of chains felt almost unreal. Across the table, Malcolm Carter stood beside him, not with the pride of a man who had won, but with the solemn strength of someone who had carried another man's hope on his back and refused to set it down. "You really did it," Jerome whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. Malcolm placed a steady hand on his shoulder and replied, "No, Jerome, we did." In that brief exchange, decades of injustice were answered with a moment of unity. All around them, the room buzzed, not with noise, but with meaning. Reporters scrambled to capture it. Pens flying across notepads, cameras snapping, news already being drafted in trembling hands. But for those who had sat and watched every word, every objection, every injustice, this wasn't just a headline, it was history. Malcolm took a step forward, not just toward the exit, but toward something far larger than the trial that had just ended. His voice rose again, steady, commanding, not in anger, but in truth. "Let's not pretend this is the first time something like this has happened," he said, locking eyes with those around the room. "And let's not pretend it'll be the last." His gaze swept from juror to juror, then to the prosecutors who sat stunned, and finally to the gallery. "There are more Lancasters out there," he continued, voice unwavering, "more courtrooms like this one. And if we don't fight back, if we don't hold them accountable, it will happen again." His words landed with weight, not just in minds, but in hearts. They weren't just meant for the people in that room. They were meant for every citizen who ever questioned whether the system could truly protect the innocent. A new silence followed, deep, reflective, and then Malcolm turned to Jerome once more. "Come on," he said gently. Together, they began walking toward the doors, step by step shedding the weight of accusation, doubt, and fear. But just before they exited, Malcolm paused and turned back. There was one last thing he needed to say, not to win, not to persuade, but to remind. "Justice doesn't just happen," he said. "It takes people like you, like me, fighting for it. Every single day." His voice was softer now, but no less powerful. "And this fight," he paused, offering a faint but knowing smile, "it's only just beginning, because justice is never given. It's taken back." And with that, they stepped through the same doors that had once seemed like the gateway to a system stacked against them, now the entrance to something new. Behind them, the courtroom was no longer a place of intimidation. It was a place where power had been held to account, where truth had found a voice, and where justice, long denied, had finally risen to its feet. As Malcolm Carter and Jerome Willis stepped through the courthouse doors and into the open air, a weight lifted, not just from their shoulders, but from the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the trial's seismic shift. Behind them, the echoes of Eleanor Lancaster's downfall still reverberated through the building like distant thunder, a haunting reminder of the power she had once wielded and the fear she had instilled. But those echoes were now fading, replaced by something purer, something long overdue, justice reclaimed. The reporters outside scrambled to capture the moment, shouting questions, snapping photos, broadcasting live updates to a public that had already begun to buzz with the news. But Malcolm wasn't interested in attention. His mission had never been fame, it had always been truth. And now that truth had broken through years of silence, exposing rot that had been festering behind polished benches and well-spoken rulings. As he stood next to Jerome, who was still visibly overwhelmed, as if freedom itself was too large to fully comprehend, Malcolm allowed himself one small exhale. Not of celebration, but of release. The job wasn't finished. This was just one battle in a much larger war. Inside the courtroom, people were still processing what had just occurred. The jurors sat in stunned silence, many replaying every word, every choice they had made, realizing they hadn't just decided a verdict, they had helped tear down a wall of corruption. The gallery, once quiet out of fear, now murmured with rising voices of reflection, outrage, and hope, and the court officers, who had once moved in obedience to Lancaster's every signal, now stood unsure, as if they too were beginning to see how deeply the system they served had betrayed its own ideals. Daniel Calloway remained seated, his face pale, eyes still locked on the bench where Lancaster had once presided. The realization of complicity was a heavy burden to carry, and though he hadn't spoken a word, the guilt in his eyes said enough. He had followed the rules, yes, but never questioned who wrote them, or why. He had believed in the system, and the system had used him. Now he, too, would have to decide what kind of man he would be moving forward. Would he remain a cog in a broken machine, Or would he find the courage to help rebuild it? That question lingered in the air, unanswered. Back outside, Malcolm turned to Jerome, his voice low but firm. "This moment belongs to you," he said, "not just because you were freed, but because you endured, because you stood tall when the world tried to crush you." Jerome looked at him, eyes glassy but grateful. He didn't have the words to respond. And he didn't need them. The strength in his silence spoke volumes. He was no longer a victim. He was a survivor, a symbol. Together, they began walking away from the courthouse, each step taking him farther from the weight of accusation, closer to something like peace. But just before they reached the sidewalk, Malcolm paused. He turned back for one last look, not at the building itself, but at what it now represented. Once, it had been a fortress of fear, a place where truth was buried beneath bureaucracy and bias. Now, it had become something else entirely. A place where a line had been drawn. A place where someone had stood up and said, "Enough," and won. As people gathered behind them, activists, supporters, strangers who had followed the case online and came to see justice in real life, Malcolm raised his voice one final time. Not to the court, not to the media, but to the people. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Justice doesn't live in buildings. It lives in people. It lives in those who refuse to stay silent. In those who choose to fight. Even when the fight seems impossible." He let the words hang, just long enough to let them settle. Then he added, "What happened today wasn't a miracle. It was a reckoning. And if we want real change, it can't stop here." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some nodding, some holding back tears. It wasn't just Jerome's story anymore. It was theirs. It was everyone's. Malcolm turned back to Jerome, and with a slight, humble smile, nodded. "Let's go," he said. "We've got work to do." And with that, they walked away, not toward an ending, but toward the beginning of something far bigger, something that would outlast headlines, outshine verdicts, and reach into courtrooms and communities that still hadn't seen the light. Because justice, as Malcolm had said, is never given, it is taken back, one voice, one fight, one truth at a time.